Good afternoon and welcome to today's event, Money, Lies, and God, with journalist and author Katherine Stewart, sponsored by the ICJS, which is the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies located here in Baltimore, Maryland. I am Heather Miller Rubens, the executive director and the Roman Catholic scholar for ICJS. If you're not familiar with ICJS, we're an independent educational interreligious nonprofit founded in 1987, and we've been working for nearly 4 decades to build an interreligious society where dialogue replaces division, friendship overcomes fear, and education eradicates ignorance. We do this by creating communities of interfaith learning in the greater Baltimore area. Through public-facing scholarship and relationship-focused educational programs, we create opportunities for people to gather who believe differently from one another so that they can connect and learn from one another. If you'd like more information about our organization, please visit our website, which is icjs.org. For today's conversation, we will have time at the end for audience questions. So please enter all of your questions for Katherine into the chat, into the Submit Questions Here handle. We'll be collecting them throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. We'll also be sharing another number of resources throughout today's presentation, and all of those resources, along with a recording of today's program, will be sent to everyone who registered for the event. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and author. We are honored to be joined today by New York Times bestselling author Katherine Stewart, whose latest book is the powerful and deeply reported volume, which I have right here, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. In this book, Katherine traces how financial power, disinformation, and ideological movements, especially movements blending religion and politics, have coalesced in ways that challenge the very foundations of democratic life here in the United States. Her work builds on years of careful reporting at the intersection of religion, power, and public life. And she offers not just analysis, but a framework to understand what's at stake for our civic future. Her previous book, The Power Worshippers, formed the basis of a documentary feature film, God and Country, which was produced by the late Rob and Michelle Reiner. And we are so thrilled to have Katherine here today to talk to us about the book and about especially this past year. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to you, Heather, and to the ICJS for hosting this conversation for the work that you do. Very important interfaith work.
Thank you so much. You're the second author in a series that we have. One way that I thought we could begin for folks who may not have read the book yet is to invite you to read an excerpt from your introduction. Would that be something you'd be willing to do?
I would love to, and
Okay,
thank you for asking. Actually, we've discussed this, and I prepared, so I don't have a physical book with me, but I do have it on screen. So I'm just going to read it to the camera because I have it
great.
right here, if that's all right. This is from the introduction. Abraham Lincoln had it right when he said that the United States is dedicated to a proposition. The American idea, as he saw it, is the familiar one articulated in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. It says that all people are created equal, that a free people in a pluralistic society may govern themselves, that they do so through laws deliberated in public, grounded in appeals to reason, and applied equally to all, and that they establish these laws through democratic representation in government. In the centuries after 1776, in its better moments, the United States exported this revolutionary creed and inspired people around the world to embrace their freedom. But in recent years, a political movement has emerged that fundamentally does not believe in the American idea. It claims that America is dedicated not to a proposition, but to a particular religion and culture. It asserts that an insidious and alien elite has betrayed and abandoned the nation's sacred heritage. It proposes to redeem America, and it acts on the extreme conviction that any means are justified in such a momentous project. It takes for granted that certain kinds of Americans have a right to rule and that the rest have a duty to obey. No longer casting the United States as a beacon of freedom, it exports this counter-revolutionary creed through alliances with leaders and activists who are themselves hostile to democracy. This movement has captured one of the nation's two major political parties and now controls the presidency, Congress, and the Supreme Court. It claims to be patriotic, yet its leading thinkers explicitly model their ambitions on corrupt and illiberal regimes abroad that render education, the media, and the corporate sector subservient to a one-party authoritarian state. How did such an anti-American movement take root in America? As a reporter, I like to look first and theorize later. My goal has been to record what I have seen and heard from the leaders and supporters of the anti-democratic movement in the auditoriums and breakout rooms at national conferences, around the table at informal gatherings of activists, in the living rooms of the rank and file, and in the pews of hardline churches. What I have seen does not come down to any single demographic or even ideology. The real story of the authoritarian right features a rowdy mix of personalities, often working at odds with one another. Apostles of Jesus, atheistic billionaires, reactionary Catholic theologians, pseudo-Platonic intellectuals, woman-hating opponents of the gynocracy, high-powered evangelical networkers, Jewish devotees of Ayn Rand, pronatalists preoccupied with the dearth of white babies, COVID truthers, and battalions of spirit warriors who appear to be inventing a new style of religion, even as they set about undermining democracy at its foundations. And thank you for letting me read that section. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much for that. I think gives us a good snapshot for the entire project. So I kind of want to go back to how you got into this. You've been thinking, reading, interviewing, writing about religion and politics in the United States for well over a decade. How did this research interest come about for you? What prompted you to write this particular book on money, religion, and anti-democratic movements?
I first got into the topic in late 2008, 2009, really as a mom, when something called a Good News Club came to my kids' public elementary school in Santa Barbara, California. So Good News Clubs are designed to convert very little children in their earliest years of learning, often kids who are too young to read, into a deeply fundamentalist form of evangelical Christianity. And they install themselves in public elementary schools, not in religious schools. We're talking public schools. So I was really astonished to learn that there were thousands of these clubs operating in public schools nationwide, telling little kids that they were going to go to hell without Jesus. And they sometimes would tell them that their families would go to hell unless they needed to attend the right kind of church, right? And in our community, I could see how these clubs were confusing very little kids into thinking that their school supported a particular form of religion. And in fact, when the club first came to our school, I wondered if our administration also supported a particular form of religion, because public schools have a cloak of authority in the minds of not just kids, but adults, right? They're representatives of the government. So little kids especially think that if it's being taught in school, it must be what their school wants them to believe. And I could see that the adults using the clubs were basically using their position inside the school to tell kids attending these clubs to recruit and proselytize and often bully their non-Christian classmates or their differently Christian classmates. I remember one woman I knew, she's Catholic. She sent her daughter to a Good News Club right after school, immediately after the bell rings, same classroom. She said it was so convenient. I thought she'd get some religious education. And she said, Mommy, we're going to go to hell because we're Catholic, right? So at first I thought this kind of thing was a relic of the American past. And it turns out I was really wrong about this. The more I learned about these clubs and the movement that they represented, the more concerned I became. So I was really sort of stunned by the legal sophistication that was behind this movement. I was struck by the fact that they'd won key legal case allowing them to be placed in public schools, whereas previously they'd been excluded due to Establishment Clause concerns. That they were, making use of public schools, but bashing public education as a whole. I could see that these clubs were, their sponsoring organization, the Child Evangelism Fellowship, was deeply connected to a whole network of advocacy groups and a kind of legal advocacy sphere and networking organizations. So they weren't just one organization sort of working on their own. They were really part of a network, right? I published a book about this topic in 2012 called The Good News Club. It's really about the religious right's assault on public education as one feature of an attack on democracy. And uh, and that sort of got me into the topic, and that's was 17 years ago, and I've published now 3 books on this topic.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure if you're aware, ICJS working with teachers in schools is a key component of what we do, both public, religious, and independent schools. And the kind of core question around this, like how do you empower teachers, administrators, parents to actually help children participate in a multi-religious democracy? What kind of both civic education and ways to talk about religion and religious diversity can we empower teachers to do to support democracy? And it sounds like the Good News Club that is not their aim. They're not their goal.
No, I mean,
So,
I'm so glad you brought that up because one
yeah.
of the things that really alarmed me about the club is that I knew a little girl and her family, and she was the only girl who's a member of religious minority in her class at school.
Mhm.
So she was the only Jewish kid in her school. So her 6-year-old classmate approached her on the playground. I write about this in my book, The Good News Club. She said,
Yeah.
"You're going to go to hell because you don't believe in Jesus." And the other little girl, Zoe, said, "That's not true." And they started to fight. And they're 6 years old and it's recess, right? And so
Yeah.
the teacher overheard this exchange and she explained, different religions have different beliefs about these things. And Zoe, the Jewish girl, she was fine with that. She's like, "Yeah, right. We have our religion, you have your religion, and that's cool." But Ashley started to cry, the girl who was attending the News Club. And
Yeah.
she said, "I know it must be true because they taught it to me in school, and they don't teach things in school that aren't true." And then she said, "How can they lie to me in school?" And that story really gets to the heart of my problem, my issue with the Good News Club. I don't have a problem with kids talking about their religion with their friends at school. That's fine. My kids have done it, their friends have done it.
Mhm.
Um, and that's been sort of actually interesting and wonderful in a lot of ways. But I do have a problem with kids being deceived into thinking that their public school supports a very particular form of the Christian faith, and then using that misinformation to to bully their peers.
Yeah, and I think that particular the last point around bullying is an important one to lift up. Like, what does it mean to engage in sort of name calling or ostracizing, and how do we help kids, little kids, navigate those moments of schoolyard bullying, which then translate to adult bullying, as we know in this current moment. So
Yeah.
you broke your book into sort of 3 big sections. Money. So I was thinking we could maybe start there. And I was thinking the iconic Woodward and Bernstein quote about Watergate, right? Follow the money, could equally apply to you and your investigative journalism. And I was just wondering if you could talk with our audience about how you understand the connection between money and the anti-democratic movement that you're following.
Well, in the past decades, we've had a massive wealth inequality in our society. I mean, don't take my word for it. Just look at the economic data. The rich have become so much richer. The poor are really struggling, and even the middle class is really struggling. And there are a lot of very wealthy people in America. They're not all in on this movement, of course. Many of them are funding sort of democracy supporting initiatives. But there's a sector of very wealthy people who are pouring money into this movement. They are, investing in anti-democratic projects. I'm thinking about people, and I name a number of them, but I'll just throw out a few names like Richard and Elizabeth Uihlein, or Barry Side, or the Wilks brothers, or Tim Dunn, members of the Prince DeVos family juggernaut, or some of the tech pros who are now contributing to the movement in different ways. The important thing about them is that they're not any one type. Religiously, they're all over the place.
Mhm.
They are drawn to, they want economic policies that benefit plutocratic wealth. They want low taxes for the rich or no taxes. Many of them are involved in polluting businesses, so they've gone all in on climate denial, where you can't even talk about climate science, or you can't use words like environmentalism or clean energy in federal documents. Everybody listening here, I'm sure, is familiar with all the banned words now in federal grants and documents, and a number of them relate to climate and pollution, et cetera. But I think more than that, some of them call themselves, the interesting thing, they call themselves, pro-capitalist people. We just want to let the markets do their thing, they say. But at the same time, a lot of them are looking for privileged contracts for their monopolistic businesses, which is really, putting the thumb on the scale for them. And they also, many of them want taxpayer subsidies. Think about Elon Musk, who's received billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies. And now he's on track to be a trillionaire. So they don't just want policies that privilege plutocratic wealth. They also, I think, in the back of a lot of these very wealthy people live in sort of islands, right? Or like in walled environments where they sort of keep the riffraff out and everybody around them sort of is a yes person. But I think over the walls, over the high walls, they can sort of hear the cries of America's middle and working classes saying, you know what, this is really not working for us too well, and maybe you need to pay your taxes like everyone else. And they don't like that. I mean, I think for a lot of those folks, it's a bit of a narcissistic injury. So they're drawn to ideologies that justify plutocratic wealth, that tell them that they truly earned every single penny they own with their bare hands, and that's how it should be. And I think they've gone all in on this idea that, they have a right to rule. They're better than everyone else, and everyone else needs a duty to obey. And so they've invested in the infrastructure of the anti-democratic movement, the policy groups, the legal advocacy sphere, the networking organizations, a lot of the think tanks, the propaganda sphere, or sort of right-wing disinformation sphere.
That's the place I want to move to next, that disinformation and the kind of category of lies. You have a whole section on this, which is just so important, I think, for folks to understand. And I think any conversation around lies and disinformation has to be paired with a conversation about truth and what does it mean to pursue truth, both as individuals, but then also as a society. And, traditionally, religious communities of all stripes have been concerned with truth and with truth seeking. And so in some ways, I was struck by, where the seeds of disinformation that are being planted, where they are taking root and growing up. And it just seems like religious communities and religious people have been particularly prone to disinformation. And I'm wondering if you could, is that a correct read, or if you could say more about that?
Well, I think people who have had disinformation served up to them all day, every day through their social media are prone to, and through the media they consume, are prone to disinformation. I think people dealing with anxieties about status loss, whether justified or unjustified, are particularly prone to disinformation. Um, this points to kind of what we're dealing with today. It's not just about a few policy changes on social issues. It's not just about culture wars. We're really facing a political war against democracy itself because democracy depends on the value, the idea that truth actually matters. I'm not sure how political I'm supposed to get here, but we see representatives of our government lying constantly, just, without any kind of shame. And I think that this movement is nihilistic because they don't just tolerate the lies. They almost see like lying as a thing that you have to do, like a necessary thing. If I think with these lies, they're basically expressing the idea that there's no value in the world as it actually exists. There's no value in truth itself. And I think that a lot of the leaders think it's better to keep the populace disinformed, because it makes them easier to control. How do you get them to vote for politicians who are supporting economic policies that are going to hurt them? Well, you feed them lies and you tell them that you're fighting for them.
And I think you do such a good job of making clear the kind of oligarch influence that has this. But I also think you do a nice job of talking about foreign influence and the way that certain stories are amplified by adversaries to the United States in order to sort of sow more dissension among Americans. And so
Mhm.
this just brings us to the category of social media and the internet and where people are getting their information, where they're seeking truth. Do you have any guidance about media usage or media consumption that you could share with our audience?
And there are no easy answers, are there? I mean,
Yeah.
some folks really specialize in how to talk to your Uncle Randy or your brother or
Mhm.
they've written books about it. One thing I would say that, you know, if someone has really been steeped in disinformation, then they seem like they're really deeply in it. It's always worth having those conversations, finding common ground, trying to bring in new piece of information, try to show them, what is truth and what's not. But I would say if you're just a lone voice in their world, you might, and they're consuming this stuff all day, you might
Mm.
not get very far. I mean, I often think about the words of a movement leader like Ralph Reed. He's the head of the um, Faith and Freedom Coalition. Every year I try to go to his Road to Majority conference. He's been in the movement for a long time. And he said, remember once he said, pay no attention to the polls. Our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he's right. This representatives, or I would say people who lend their support to this movement, are a minority of our country, right? But they vote in disproportionate numbers because much of I would say, the Christian nationalist movement is actually it functions as a giant voter turnout machine. And they know very well in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, and an additional number have their vote sort of taken from them through race-based gerrymandering, voter suppression, etc. You don't need majorities to win elections. All you need are disproportionately mobilized minorities. So I think if you're really looking to change things, um,
Mhm.
your time and energy might be better spent on the disenfranchised, on the low propensity voters, on people who can't vote or just didn't bother for one reason or another. Just helping them understand that their vote counts, or helping them figure out how to vote. There's a lot of people. I mean, it's embarrassing to say, but as soon as I was able to vote, it took me a little while to start voting because I couldn't figure out how to get registered when I was young. So a lot of people who would be in position to contribute their voice are not. And if one is looking for a place to spend their energy, that might be just, keep in mind that that might be a more productive use of their time.
Yeah, in this particular election year now that we're in 2026, that's an
Yeah.
important message to get out there. So you mentioned Christian nationalism, and I'm just for folks on the call who may not be familiar with the term, and it's a contested term. How do you define it? How do you understand Christian nationalism?
Christian nationalism is both an ideology and a political movement. The core belief of the ideology is basically that America was founded as a Christian nation, as they understand Christianity. Our laws should be based on the Bible as they interpret it. The idea that everything good in America derives from this sort of specific heritage and cultural heritage, and everything bad in America results from its deviation from these supposed historical foundations. And this belief essentially comes with an authoritarian conviction that any means are justified in restoring America as a Christian nation. This is more, I would say, confined to the leadership. They say no government is legitimate if it isn't Christian nationalist. So the ideology is really anti-democratic because it's saying that the foundation of America, of legitimate government in America, is in a particular interpretation of a particular religion, and that's what makes us distinctive, rather than our democratic system of governance or the fact that we live in a democratic republic or our Constitution, or a long, if I would say, deeply imperfect, but still, long history of assimilating very diverse people in a pluralist society. But in addition to an ideology, it's also a political movement. And I think it's arguably more important as a political movement, an organized quest for power. Because as a movement, it's highly organized, if in a sort of decentralized way. And it's leadership driven. It's not it's organization driven, leadership driven. The agenda is really not set by the rank and file, the foot soldiers, as I call them.
Mhm.
The leadership's fundamental aim is to acquire power, and it does so by, using the funders' resources to cultivate a loyal base through sort of Christian national appeals to Christian nationalist ideology.
Yeah, so I think at ICJS, we understand kind of a counterpoint to this as religious pluralism, as originally sort of defined and developed by Diana Eck up at Harvard, but really the sort of space of interfaith and interreligious engagement really is, we're trying to inspire people to be champions for religious pluralism. And so if you're, again, not familiar with the term, there are kind of four key things that define pluralism. It's not just an acknowledgement that we have religious and ethical diversity, but a robust commitment to engage with that diversity in civic life, and not just tolerance, but a commitment to pursue kind of interreligious understanding, and not relativism, but an encounter of commitments of real differences, but also a commitment to robust and messy dialogue, which I think is the basis of a democratic society, right? And if we can't talk to one another about our differences, deliberate about our differences, we are again no longer in a democracy. And I just was curious about how you understand religious pluralism and democracy and the democratic ideal. And then what do you think the relationship should be between religion and democracy?
Thanks. It's a really great question. Thanks so much for asking. In a functioning liberal democracy, we must have the freedom to exercise religion, whatever religion we happen to believe in, with the understanding that religion is, as James Madison put it, about the relationship between the individual and their idea of the sacred. So that's freedom of exercise. And of course, our leaders can express their religious beliefs in public and talk about their faith in even as in a position as a president with this while still acknowledging the religious diversity of our country. In public policy and debate, however, there should be a freedom from adherence to any particular religion in the sense that all appeals and all persuasion connected with policy that affects everyone, that is, every citizen, should be made on the basis of facts and reason and evidence that are available to members of all religions, right? Available to members of society without regard to their religious belief. I mean, we sort of like the idea of the common good, the idea of policies that benefit the public. So that's sort of policy. That's a sort of policy part of it, which I think a lot of religious nationalists disagree with now. They're, saying that our public policy should be based on their interpretation of the Bible. Obviously, they pick and choose. So that's not religious freedom, in my view. Religious freedom in a democracy doesn't mean a right to discriminate against people you view as inferior to you. It doesn't mean crafting policy on the basis of your particular religious beliefs. And even at the symbolic level, I think it does not mean identifying the nation as identified with a particular version of a particular religious heritage. And I think that the modern Christian nationalist take basically excludes this. They say it's a license to discriminate, against those of whom they disapprove, whether they're people of different faiths or different ethnicities or women or whoever.
Yeah, so you've also, in your research, spent a lot of time with religious people and in religious spaces. And indeed, I think some of the best anecdotes in Money Lies and God come out of times when you've been in churches or been in houses of worship. And there was one in particular where you're invited to speak in tongues at a charismatic Christian community, and you demur, but it's a really
I
sort of
tried.
yeah.
Honestly, I tried. I
Okay,
really tried.
and we're
Um,
not successful. That's the
well, I think they were a little bit disappointed with me because I did what they told. And I remember the lady said, this is, by the way, back in 2009. It
okay.
was a church that was affiliated with the New Apostolic Reformation, which many of your listeners will be familiar with. It's a sort of loose network in the charismatic vein. It
Yeah.
was a very multiracial church. The I would say charismatic Christianity. It's a uh, uh, it's a transnational movement, very
Yeah.
multi-ethnic movement. It was a lovely church. Everybody was very warm and welcoming, and they asked me to repeat hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. And they said, you need to loosen your tongue. So I really tried and it wasn't working. So then they said, okay, repeat, I love you, I love you, I love you. And I tried that. They were sort of disappointed with me. I felt like they wanted me to just sort of fake it until I could make it, but I couldn't do that. I mean, this is the thing. I'm not a kind of cybernaut who does all her research by Googling around. I'm an
Yeah.
old-fashioned investigative journalist, and I really believe in going places and talking to humans. And one of the things I really loved about this church, or that was really, I would say, in well, it was an incredibly warm and welcoming community. It was a working class, largely working class
Mhm.
congregation, and it was clearly a place of great comfort to a lot of the people there. But there are a couple things that really struck me. The reason I went there first is because they were busing their congregants to a whole other school district on the other edge of town, where none of them sent their kids, and they were objecting to a sex education curricula. Now, this is 2009, long before there's anything remotely trans in any public school, right? They were just teaching about birth control, and that's what they objected to. They objected to teaching kids about birth control. And this is in the Permian Basin. It was one of the regions of the country with the highest concentration of teen pregnancy. So the school was really just determined to kind of help kids avoid unwanted and unintended pregnancy. And that's what they objected to. And they cast this as a kind of demonic um, invasion of the public school. This is characteristic of much of the New Apostolic Reformation, where they see struggles, but playing between demons in the heavens, as the struggles, political
Mhm.
struggles here on earth, as reflecting struggles and between good and demonic forces in the heavens. So that was really interesting to me. And then another thing that was really interesting is that the pastor seemed to take a very skeptical view of education as a whole. I remember he's brought up the issue of college or community college, and he said, you can get your degree, but then you need to get victory over your degree. And I remember him saying this because it was a way of really expressing this idea that, he wasn't really in favor of college, but if you really needed to do it, fine, but don't let it make you too critical or too smart.
Yeah, in some ways we started here too, talking about schools and classrooms, and there's such a way, right? We're also a little, I think it's 101 years since the Scopes monkey trial. There's a way in which America's classrooms have been a site for contemporary culture wars, but also historically, right? For not only religious diversity, but also contested sites for racial diversity and thinking about the integration of schools. We as a country have really continually kicked the can on the question of what does it mean to be an educated American, and can we have a common agreement about what that entails, right? In a variety of subjects. all the way around. And I'm wondering, yeah, again, how often have schools and classroom issues come up in your research? Because it seems like it's a theme.
Well, public schools have been flashpoints for the culture wars, and a key focus of this movement for decades. So, I started researching this movement 17 years ago, and even by then it was clear that the movement was deeply hostile to the institution of public education, precisely because it's meant to be non-sectarian, neither affirming nor denying any particular faith, welcoming of all families, regardless of their religious backgrounds. Um, I mean, think about some of the religious right leaders of an earlier time. Jerry Falwell in 1979, he made the agenda really clear. He said, I hope to see the day when there are no more churches, when there are no more public schools, churches will have taken them over and Christians will be running them. And other powerful religious right figures, such as D. James Kennedy, he was a pastor who had Coral Ridge Ministries. His ministry received at least $5.5 million from the family of former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos. He had like a very popular radio show. He was like very powerful, what they call electronic minister at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he called public schools atheistic and amoral, and he said children were being brainwashed in godless secularism. I have a pamphlet. It's a I'm sorry, a sermon that he delivered called something like A Godless Education. And I wish I had it with me because I'd love to read from it. He said, oh, the public schools are so terrible that if this had been done by a foreign enemy, it would have been considered an act of war. I mean, it's quite a way to characterize the places that most Americans' children are learning their
Right.
ABCs, learning how to read and math. But, the destruction of public education has been this long-standing aim. But in an earlier, like a decade and a half ago, the religious right leaders and the privatizers with whom they were starting to work hand in hand were kind of discreet about what the aim was. They really did want to end public education, but they never really said so out in the open. Only a few people at the margins did, you know, um, but now I think that the voices are much more bold. They want to starve what they consider the beast of public education and then redirect the flow of taxpayer money to private and I would say ideological right-wing and religious, reactionary religious schools. The fundamental goal is basically to create publicly financed religious schools that explicitly favor conservative forms of religion and conservative economic ideology. And superficially, it looks like they're trying to achieve this aim by forcing their initiatives into the public schools. Like that's the logic behind the Ten Commandments bills and a law in Texas that offered to pay teachers for teaching very young children a sectarian Christian curricula, the imposition of Bible in schools, etc. But much more consequential is kind of the expansion of voucher initiatives.
Yeah, at the
Um,
state level. Yeah.
yeah.
So I want to kind of bring us into the contemporary moment with a couple of questions, and then I'll turn to audience questions for the sort of final part of our time together. So we're in, concluding year one of Trump 2.0. What are your reflections and thoughts about this past year?
Well, I would say a lot of what we're seeing is not what we would see in a free society. The fact that, I mean, it's like every day there's just like a fresh horror. And I don't need to catalog it here
Hmm.
because I'm sure a lot of you folks are reading the news just as I have. One thing I would say is that what we're seeing in the Trump administration today is really a consequence of the um, Christian nationalist movement throwing their support behind him. Unprecedented corruption and self-dealing, efforts to control the media, the hateful racist rhetoric and religious bigotry, the misogyny, the destruction of our foreign alliances. Uh, all of it is
Yeah.
why this movement is really so dangerous to the American way of life. We've got a president who doesn't respect the law. He's willing to break things, but that makes him the perfect leader for a movement that has long not really believed in democracy in the first place. They have advocated for quite some time. When you really dig into it, I would say not necessarily the rank and file being aware of it, but the leadership for sure. They've advocated for a more authoritarian form of political order and a more theocratic order, and that's what we're seeing now. I mean, they're not really even speaking democracy's language anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even just looking back on the last 10 days, and I think that what you said, it very much resonates with me, that it's just been sort of an onslaught, that every day there's something else. And so I keep thinking back to Steve Bannon's observation of flooding the zone. When there's just so much happening, folks can't respond in a way, or you feel so overwhelmed that you retreat to despair or inaction in some ways. But this past week in particular, when President Trump sat down with the New York Times reporters for that sort of 4-hour conversation, and he said explicitly that the only sort of check is his own personal judgment and his own personal brand of morality. That was for me, a shocking statement to sort of have in the room, and again, unapologetically in the room. And yeah, like you said, the ways that we understand democracy, that's not what the executive branch is supposed to be doing. That's not how this whole sort of, and there's a new term that I think is being floated by some professors at Georgetown called neo-royalism. And which I was like, oh, because right, this isn't neoconservatism. There is this kind of return to this monarch sense, the sense of court politics in a certain way. That's this sort of old European vision of how to build society that is anti-democratic. And I was really struck by that. I want to think more about that idea of neo-royalism, but I feel like this particular year is really, it kind of captures something.
I don't think we need to go back to medieval Europe. I mean, I think we can look to other autocratic countries around the world now. Um, I think that, this kind of government is really, he's aiming for a kind of cronyistic kleptocracy with dictatorial power and theocratic features. But that, a lot of people, say, is he trying to create a theocracy? I don't think a lot of the religious nationalist countries around the world now are the most autocratic, are trying to create a pure theocracy, really. It's more that you've got a leader who can do whatever they want, a ruling elite that gets enriched through their alliance with the leader.
Yeah.
And and the theocratic stuff is often just a way of dividing the populace into the pure versus the impure, right? You're either with us or you're against us. You're obeying, you're doing a good, you're like a good with a capital G, you know, quadruple underlined, or you're subhuman. And it's also a way of by surrounding themselves, bubble wrapping themselves in sanctimony, right? Surrounding themselves with the holy men. It's a way of guarding against any real investigation of their own corruption and the harms that they're perpetrating against their own people. And, I don't think we're seeing this in Europe today. I think we're seeing it in other regions of the world.
No, that's a helpful point, right? We can look to history, we can look to contemporary actors, and we can even also look to our own American history, like the history of racial integration in the United States and the ways that Black Americans have been subjected in our own history is also a source for reflection. So we've got lots of great audience questions, so I want to move to that now. Um, so is it possible for a Jewish person to be a Christian nationalist at this time in our country? Watching what has happened in the last few weeks, I've been wrestling with how Christian nationalism is more about authoritarianism than actual religion. Side note, this is all from the questioner. I'm a Jewish woman who is confounded by Jewish people like Stephen Miller, who should know better from our history.
And that's a great question. So I think religious nationalism is a political dynamic, like authoritarianism. It's a political dynamic that afflicts political systems. It's not just a sort of set of attitudes. Um, embraced by every member of the rank and file, or even every supporter
Mhm.
of the movement. So, I mean, I wouldn't call somebody like, let's think about somebody like Barry Side, who donated $1.6 billion to form the Marble Freedom Trust, and he put Leonard Leo in charge of it. Barry Side is a Jewish Chicago billionaire. Leonard Leo has long been a money man of the religious right, and he's ultra-conservative Catholic.
Yep.
And thanks to Leo, a lot of the money goes into two different organizations, one of which is, I think, the Concord Fund. Then the money flows into the Alliance Defending Freedom, which promotes a kind of Christian nationalist agenda in our courts. So if you ask Barry Side, what do you believe? I wouldn't say he sort of ticks all the boxes. He certainly wouldn't describe himself, I doubt, as a Christian nationalist. I mean, he doesn't speak himself. He sort of has an interlocutor through whom he speaks.
Yeah.
We don't know unless we have him in the room and can ask him directly. But you can say that with his donation, he is lending support to a Christian nationalist agenda. But I agree with the questioner that I think what we're really seeing today is better described in a way as a form of authoritarianism. I think that, as with many sort of theocratic governments, some of the religion is really just a way to get the rank and file on board. When you look at the leadership, do they really believe it?
Yeah. So we got lots of great questions here. So here's another one. I'm interested in academic explorations of the theme that Christian nationalism has latched onto Trump as the idea of a Cyrus or a non-Christian Messiah, sort of the Old Testament Persian leader, and different ways of interpreting Trump is probably not the ideal Christian, right? That is maybe an understatement in some ways. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that and any ways that you've seen biblical interpretation or biblical tropes being used in your reporting.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And in fact, I wrote a column just on that topic in the New York Times a few years ago. If you Google like Catherine Stewart Trump Cyrus New York Times, you'll find it.
Okay, that's great to
To,
know.
to summarize, they compare him to Cyrus sort of as the idea is that he's an imperfect ruler through whom God chose to enact his will, right? That he himself is not a member of the elect, but God said, you with all your flaws, you are going to be able to carry out my will. And you hear him often referred to in those types of terms in sort of pro-MAGA spaces. Here's the thing about kings. They're not the kings of democracies, right? They
Mhm.
are the law unto themselves. And that makes him the perfect representative of a movement that doesn't believe in democracy, that, wants someone who can shift the goalposts. And the thing about Trump is that he he shifts the, he shifts the he ignores every law and constitutional amendment that he doesn't like. He's like shifting the Overton window again and again and again and again until it's no longer even on the playing field. And that's how you break democracy itself. He's also somebody who's, willing to crack heads. And this is a movement that is fine with the sort of head cracking as long as the head cracking is directed, at people of whom they disapprove, sort of undeserving others. So when you think about some of the really horrific actions we're seeing by ICE and how he's defending this, I mean, just today I saw a video of ICE. There was a 10th grader who
Mhm.
happened to be an American citizen. ProPublica did a terrific report on this. ICE grabbed him, they beat him up. They actually stole his phone and tried to resell it. And he found that out. He was bleeding. He was like, man, I'm like an American citizen. They, beat him up. They abandoned him bleeding in some other part of town, and then they took his phone, tried to sell it, on some like resale site or something like that. He found it by doing Where's My Phone? Um,
Wow.
ProPublica did all the reporting. I mean, you think, how could a movement support something like this? How could these leaders? Well, this boy was probably a member of whatever group that they feel is undeserving, and therefore they're absolutely fine with it. Like a lot of the violence is like this sort of performance of brutality that serves the emotional needs of people who feel like he's fighting for us and we're going to punish them. And Trump says so very much, at a lot of the speeches that he gives or at his rallies. I remember, I've been to a number of events, religious right events, where he's spoken like to Majority or National Pro-Life Summit or Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA America Fest, where Trump will say, our greatest threat is not our foreign enemies, as dangerous as they may be. The greatest threat we face is the enemy from within. And he is talking about anyone who is not with the MAGA movement, including, by the way, rhinos or Republicans in name only, Republicans who are not on board.
Yeah, and again, to this point, right? That this is a trope or a play. A play is a better word in the authoritarian playbook. When you move towards identifying internal, folks who disagree as the enemy from within, this is horrible, horrible consequences, and we're seeing that in real time. We've got a lot of questions from the audience from folks who are both educators, curriculum designers, also administrators in different school systems in Maryland here. So I'm going to try to get a couple of these questions together. So this is someone who works with educational governing bodies, so those who write social studies and English curriculum standards. This person has encountered quite a few people who are unwilling to engage with questions about religion at all or to talk about the influence of Christian nationalism in public education. Your research points to this moment as being the result of a long game, right? And the sort of impact of those ideas. How might we work to help professionals, teaching professionals, educational professionals, understand how to respond to these influences?
That's a very challenging task because, I think, you know, ideally, our public schools function most effectively when they set aside issues of religion and politics, except as a sort of teaching, teaching the history or religious literacy or things like that, when we can kind of come together in support of our children and their collective future, and without sort of taking a very, a side in a partisan fight. So I think it's very challenging. I'm not sure what kind of situations or this particular questioner is referring to, but there's a lot of material coming out of curriculum materials that has been shaped by an agenda, of one sort or another, and it would be really wonderful if we could sort of, you know, we don't need needless wars erupting in our kindergarten playgrounds,
Right.
needless religious wars or needless political battles erupting in our public school classrooms. On the other hand, I think, teaching critical thinking is vital. Teaching kids how to distinguish between truth and fact and propaganda is vital. A number of people are calling for, more of an effort to teach religious literacy. We need to teach media literacy, and we need that yesterday because AI is here already, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of stuff out there that's unfortunately, coming for our kids.
No, I think that's something we're beginning to think about here at ICJS is the role of AI in, certainly creating more disinformation and in creating spaces where people are just dehumanized in really horrific ways. But is there a way to also counter that with increasing interfaith understanding, increasing other capacities? Who's investing in that? How can we sort of build out that side of it? So
We
here's another
just want to
question.
add, just sorry to that. I think we can teach about democracy
Yeah,
and the foundations of democracy without it becoming, um, you know, polit uh, politicized, I should say. We can
yeah.
teach about what defines democracy, what defines autocracy. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, just civics education on
Yeah,
the whole,
civics
right?
is really important.
So the current Trump administration has made a task force to eradicate Christian bias. Are you following this task force work? What do you think that will result in?
I think it is going to result, as it already has, in a kind of privileging of a certain interpretation of the Christian faith in law and policy. And the amazing thing is that if you are a Christian, as I think many, if not most Christians are, who anchors your idea of human equality in your faith, who believes that in do unto others, who believes in taking care of society's vulnerable,
Mhm.
there is no freedom in this kind of religious freedom for you.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's I think an important point for religious communities and people to sit with, is sort of understanding what the future of religious freedom will look like under this administration. So,
you've seen pastors pepper sprayed,
yeah,
arrested, thrown to the ground, called fake Christians. When I was at America Fest, which is Charlie Kirk's annual, well, late Charlie Kirk's annual event, Turning Point event, there was a head of Turning Point USA Faith. That's a pretty big job. This guy, Lucas Miles, who wrote a book titled something called like Woke Jesus, the heresy destroying the Christian church. What does he identify as woke Jesus? He includes the social gospel in the heresy destroying the Christian church. The social gospel is how I think many, if not most, Christians understand the gospel. But now this is sort of being described as a heresy, and you hear talk in these spaces about the sin of empathy, which I
yeah.
think for many religious people, including many religious Christians, see as a religious value, core, indispensable religious value.
No, that's a move that I've been watching the last couple of years, the way that empathy and a sort of socially justice-oriented Christianity has been called heresy, has been demonized.
Yeah, and Miles said we're going to eradicate this from, the Christian church. And he said, we've formed a new Council of Nicaea to sort of eradicate the sin of wokeness from Christian churches. And I'm thinking, what are they going to do? Try and take away their tax privileges? Like, I mean, they can call them fake Christians all they want, but like this is how, like most, I think many, if not most American Christians understand their faith.
So I want to end or recognize our time is coming to a close. I don't want people to leave feeling despondent or despairing, right? I mean, in some ways, even what we've talked about the last 15 minutes, it seems like anti-democracy movement that they're winning right now, and sort of dismantling democratic norms and safeguards and institutions and not allowing our religious diversity to be a powerful force for good in the United States. And so I recognize that we almost need to build a counter movement that is again affirming of democracy and affirming of religious pluralism. Are you hopeful about such a prospect? What are things we could do here at ICJS to help with that effort?
I think hope is in action. I don't think it's a passive thing. So, I think what the work you guys are doing is really vital. And fortunately, at the end of Money Lies in God, I have a whole section on the things that we can do um, in really specific ways in order to, affirm and improve our democracy. Local action is really critical because a lot of the stuff filters to the local level. We need to abandon purity tests. We need a really big tent. Those of us who believe in democracy and its values are a really diverse country. We're not going to agree on everything, and we probably shouldn't get everything what we want. No one should. But if we can agree on some core principles, values of equality and pluralism and democracy, we can and should work together. There's so many different meaningful ways to engage in democracy building organizations. Getting out the base is really important. Protecting the vote is really important. Going after low propensity voters. There are so many other recommendations that I make at the end of Money Lies in God. And I'm just really grateful to you, Heather, and to ICJS for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Well, thank you so very much, Catherine. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for this wonderful book. And thank you to our audience for joining us here today. A survey will show up after you log out of today's event. Please do take a few minutes to answer the questions to help us measure and improve future work. Your responses are all confidential. If you'd like to participate in more programs or our efforts to build a multi-religious democracy, we encourage you to visit icjs.org. And as always, we're a non-sectarian, independent, unaffiliated with any academic or religious institution organization. We are supported by people like you, and we try to have all of our programming available at no cost. That means that we have to rely on donations, big and small. So if you have the capacity to do so, we are very grateful for your support. Thank you again, Catherine, and I look forward to a future conversation.
Thank you. Likewise.